The weight of memories. Roberto Morales sat by the window of his small, sparse room in Austin, Texas, staring out at the buzzing streets below. The lively world outside felt worlds apart from his own stagnant reality. At 72 years old, he was a man haunted by memories and weighted by his current existence. The walls around him felt more like a cage than a home. His son Alejandro and daughter-in-law Mariana had taken him in after a life-altering tragedy, but what had seemed like a haven at first now felt like an afterthought in their busy lives. Roberto had always prided himself on his independence. He was once a man of great strength, a hard-working farmer who had spent decades tending to his small plot of land in San Antonio. His life had been simple, but it was a life filled with purpose. Each sunrise brought new tasks. Each sunset brought a sense of accomplishment. He had lived with Sofia, his beloved wife, in a modest wooden house they built with their own hands. Their love was the cornerstone of his world. Though Alejandro was not his biological son, Roberto had raised him as his own after marrying Sofia. The boy's earnest call of "Papa" had sealed a bond stronger than blood. Roberto devoted himself to providing Alejandro with a stable and loving home, teaching him values that he hoped would guide the boy into adulthood. They were a family bound by more than just shared meals and a roof. They were bound by love. But all of that changed one fateful night. It was late summer in San Antonio when disaster struck. A sudden power outage had plunged the neighborhood into darkness. Determined to create a warm ambience, Roberto lit a candle and placed it on the table in the living room. Exhausted from a day spent harvesting potatoes with Paloma, his loyal horse, he sat down on the sofa and let his eyes drift shut. By the time Roberto awoke, the air was thick with smoke, and the walls of the house he had built with his own hands were engulfed in flames. Disoriented and choking, he tried to move, but his legs felt like lead. A neighbor, alerted by the sight of smoke billowing into the night sky, broke down the door and dragged Roberto to safety. The fire was merciless. It consumed everything in its path. Sofia's cherished photo albums, Alejandro's childhood drawings, and the simple comforts of their modest life. When Roberto awoke in the hospital weeks later, he was told he had been lucky to survive. But Roberto didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow, as if the flames had taken not just his home, but also a part of his soul. Alejandro had insisted Roberto move to Austin to recover. At first, Roberto had been grateful, but gratitude soon turned into guilt. The house that Alejandro shared with Mariana was small, and space was tight. Roberto was given the spare bedroom, which had previously been used as a playroom for their young son. Watching his grandson's toys gather dust in the corner of the room filled Roberto with a pang of regret. "They'd given up so much for me," Roberto often thought. And as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was an unwelcome guest. Alejandro and Mariana were kind but busy. Their lives revolved around demanding jobs and the constant hustle of raising a young child. Roberto, on the other hand, was left to navigate his days in solitude. The mornings were quiet, the afternoons long, and the evenings lonelier still. Teresa, their neighbor, came by occasionally to drop off meals or help Roberto with errands. Though her help was invaluable, her blunt words often stung. "They're too busy for you, Roberto," she said one day, shaking her head as she placed a plate of tamales on the table. "It's the same everywhere. Once we get old, we become invisible. A burden." Her words settled heavily on Roberto's heart. He hated feeling like a burden. He hated that his once proud life had been reduced to this: dependence, loneliness, and a creeping sense of irrelevance. On his 73rd birthday, the house was unusually quiet. Alejandro and Mariana had wished him a quick, happy birthday that morning before rushing off to work. Roberto's grandson had hugged him, but dashed out the door to catch the school bus. Teresa, ever thoughtful, left a slice of cake on the kitchen counter, but even her small gesture couldn't fill the void Roberto felt that day. He sat alone at the dining table, staring at the single candle flickering atop the cake. The memory of Sophia's laughter and the warmth of their shared birthdays washed over him like a wave, leaving him more adrift than ever. That night, something shifted within Roberto. He couldn't live like this anymore. The guilt of occupying his grandson's room, the isolation, the sense of being a burden, it was too much. He resolved to take matters into his own hands. When Alejandro returned home late that evening, exhausted from another long day at work, Roberto was waiting for him in the living room. His face was etched with determination. "Take me to a nursing home," Roberto said firmly. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of his decision. "Sell my land in San Antonio and use the money to pay for it. I don't want to be a burden to you or Mariana anymore." Alejandro looked at his father with a mixture of shock and sadness. "Papa, not now," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We'll talk about this later. I've had a long day." But Roberto wouldn't let it go. "If you won't do it, I will," he said, his voice rising. "I'll find a nursing home myself." Alejandro sighed deeply, placing a hand on Roberto's shoulder. "Please, just give me some time," he said before retreating to his room, leaving Roberto feeling more invisible than ever. As the days passed, Roberto's resolve only grew stronger. He began to research nursing homes, asking Teresa to help him navigate the internet. He made lists, compared costs, and even called a few places to inquire about availability. He was determined to ease the burden on his family, even if it meant giving up what little independence he had left. But as he planned his departure, Roberto couldn't ignore a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind, a voice that whispered of unfinished business, of things unsaid, and of a longing that went beyond the confines of his current life. Little did he know, his son Alejandro had been making plans of his own, and soon Roberto's world would be turned upside down in a way he never could have imagined. The unexpected journey. The sun rose over Austin with a golden hue, casting long, quiet shadows in Alejandro's home. Roberto Morales, still resolved to leave, had made up his mind to confront Alejandro once more. The tension between father and son hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and full of unspoken words. But that morning, Alejandro surprised Roberto by taking a different approach. "Papa," Alejandro said as he set down his coffee mug at the breakfast table, "I've been thinking about what you said." Roberto, caught off guard, looked up from his plate of eggs and tortillas. Alejandro's tone was softer than usual, almost cautious, as if he were walking a tightrope. "I know you've been feeling like you don't belong here," Alejandro continued, "and I want to change that. But before you make any decisions, let me show you something." Roberto narrowed his eyes, suspicion flaring in his chest. "Show me what?" Alejandro smiled, a rare and genuine expression that momentarily softened the tension. "Just trust me. We'll go for a drive." Though skeptical, Roberto agreed. He figured it was Alejandro's way of stalling, but curiosity got the better of him. He dressed in his best shirt, a neatly pressed button-down that Sofia had once bought for him, and followed Alejandro out to the car. The vehicle was a sleek, modern SUV that felt alien to Roberto, who still missed the simplicity of his old pickup truck. The ride began in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Alejandro navigated through the city streets with ease, but Roberto's mind was elsewhere. He gazed out the window at the bustling city, feeling a pang of nostalgia for the quiet simplicity of his San Antonio farm. The memories of his land, his horse Palomo, and the life he once shared with Sofia played like an old film reel in his mind. As the car left the city limits, Roberto noticed the scenery changing. The towering skyscrapers and crowded streets gave way to open fields and winding country roads. Alejandro's silence only heightened Roberto's curiosity. Where were they going? Was this some elaborate way of taking him to a nursing home? The thought made Roberto's stomach churn. He didn't want to spend his final years in a sterile institution, no matter how nice it might look on a brochure. After nearly an hour of driving, Alejandro pulled off the main road onto a gravel path. The car bounced slightly as it made its way down the uneven trail, surrounded by tall oak trees and patches of wildflowers. Finally, Alejandro stopped in front of a large wooden gate adorned with a simple sign, Rancho Nuevo Amancer, New Dawn Ranch. Roberto stared at the gate, confused. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Alejandro smiled and stepped out of the car. "Come on, Papa. I'll show you." As they walked through the gate, Roberto was struck by the beauty of the place. Rolling hills stretched out before them, dotted with vibrant gardens, cozy cottages, and winding stone pathways. There was a stable in the distance, where horses grazed peacefully, their tails swishing in the breeze. A group of elderly men and women sat under a large oak tree, laughing as they played a game of dominoes. The air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and the sound of birds chirping. Alejandro led Roberto down one of the stone paths, stopping in front of a charming cottage with a bright blue door. The cottage was small but inviting, with flower boxes overflowing with colorful blooms. Roberto noticed a wooden bench on the porch, its armrests shaped like horseshoes, a detail that brought a faint smile to his lips. "This," Alejandro said, turning to face his father, "is for you." Roberto blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. "For me?" Alejandro nodded. "I've been saving for this for a long time. It's a retirement community, yes, but it's not like the nursing homes you're imagining. This place is different. It's designed for people like you. People who want to stay active, be part of a community, and live with dignity." Roberto's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, taking in the vibrant atmosphere. This wasn't a place of isolation or neglect. It was a sanctuary, a place where people could thrive, not just exist. As they entered the cottage, Roberto was greeted by a cozy interior. The living room was furnished with a plush sofa, a wooden coffee table, and a bookshelf lined with books about farming, history, and poetry, topics that had always fascinated him. The kitchen was small but functional, with a window that overlooked a garden already planted with tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. In the bedroom, a quilted blanket lay neatly on the bed, its colors reminiscent of the ones Sofia used to make. Roberto felt a lump rise in his throat. "You did all this for me." Alejandro placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You've done so much for me, Papa. It's time I did something for you. I know we've had our differences, and I know I haven't always been there the way I should have. But I love you, and I want you to be happy." Roberto couldn't speak. The emotions welling up inside him were too overwhelming. He had spent months feeling like a burden, convinced that his presence was unwanted. And yet, here was Alejandro, showing him a future he hadn't dared to dream of. Over the next few hours, Alejandro gave Roberto a tour of the ranch. They visited the stables, where Roberto met a gentle mare named Estrella who reminded him of Palomo. They walked through the community garden, where residents worked together to grow fresh produce. Roberto even joined a group of men playing dominoes under the oak tree, laughing for the first time in what felt like years. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Roberto felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. As they stood by the gate, looking out at the ranch, he turned to Alejandro. "I don't know what to say," Roberto admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough." Alejandro smiled. "You don't have to say anything, Papa. Just promise me you'll give this place a chance." Roberto nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt not only wanted but needed. He saw a future here, a future filled with purpose, community, and a renewed sense of belonging. As they drove back to Austin that evening, Roberto sat in silence, gazing out at the stars beginning to dot the sky. The journey had been unexpected, but it had opened a door he hadn't even known he was searching for. Though he had entered the day with doubt and despair, he ended it with a heart full of hope. Little did Roberto know, this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would bring him closer to his family, his community, and the man he thought he had lost long ago. The seeds of belonging. The next morning, Roberto awoke in his small room in Alejandro's home, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The vivid memories of the ranch filled his mind. Its open fields, the warm smiles of its residents, and the overwhelming sense of community. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of hope. Yet he couldn't shake the lingering doubt. Could this truly be his new home? Or was it too good to be true? Alejandro, ever patient, had planned a second visit to the ranch that day. This time, he encouraged Roberto to bring a few of his belongings to see how they would fit in the new space. As Roberto packed a small bag, he hesitated over an old, worn photo album. Inside were pictures of Sofia, their home in San Antonio, and a younger Alejandro riding Palomar. These were fragments of a life he wasn't sure he was ready to leave behind. The drive to the ranch felt shorter this time, as if anticipation made the miles pass more quickly. When they arrived, Roberto noticed something he hadn't seen the day before, a small gathering of people near the stables. As they parked, Alejandro smiled. "They're waiting for you," he said simply. Roberto frowned. "For me? Why?" "You'll see." As they approached the group, Roberto was greeted by a cheerful woman in her 60s named Clara, who introduced herself as one of the ranch's coordinators. Her silver hair was pulled back into a braid, and her eyes sparkled with kindness. "Roberto, we've heard so much about you," Clara said, shaking his hand warmly. "Alejandro told us you used to farm and work with horses. We could use someone with your skills here." Roberto raised an eyebrow. "Skills? I'm an old man. What could I possibly offer?" Clara laughed. "Plenty, I'm sure. Come with me. I want to show you something." Clara led Roberto to the stables, where a group of residents was tending to the horses. The air smelled of hay and fresh earth, and the soft nickering of the animals brought a sense of familiarity that warmed Roberto's heart. Clara gestured to an empty stall at the end of the stable. "This space has been waiting for someone like you," she said. "We've been hoping to start a therapeutic riding program for residents and visitors, but we need someone who knows their way around horses. Alejandro said you might be interested." Roberto's eyes widened. "Me? Running a program?" Clara nodded. "You don't have to decide right away, but think about it. We've got the horses, the equipment, and the support. All we need is someone to lead the way." For a moment, Roberto was speechless. The idea of being needed, of having a purpose, felt foreign after so many years of feeling like a burden. He glanced at Alejandro, who was watching from a distance with a hopeful expression. "I'll think about it," Roberto said finally, his voice gruff but tinged with curiosity. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions and activities. Roberto met other residents who shared stories of their own journeys to the ranch. Some had come to escape the loneliness of city life. Others had sought a sense of purpose after retiring. Each story was different, but they all shared one common thread. The ranch had given them a new beginning. In the afternoon, Alejandro helped Roberto unpack his belongings in the cottage. As they placed the photo album on a small table by the window, Alejandro noticed his father's hesitation. "You miss her?" Alejandro said softly, referring to Sofia. Roberto nodded, his gaze distant. "Every day. She would have loved this place. She always said she wanted to grow old somewhere peaceful." Alejandro placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Then maybe this can be a way to honor her memory. You can start fresh, just like she would have wanted." Roberto didn't reply, but the weight of Alejandro's words settled in his heart. That evening, the ranch held a communal dinner under the open sky. Long wooden tables were set up beneath strings of twinkling lights, and the air was filled with the aroma of grilled vegetables and freshly baked bread. Roberto was invited to sit with a group of residents who welcomed him like an old friend. They laughed, shared stories, and made him feel like he was already part of the community. As the meal wound down, Clara stood and tapped her glass to get everyone's attention. "I want to take a moment to welcome our newest visitor, Roberto," she said with a warm smile. "We hope this place feels like home to you." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, and Roberto felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent so long feeling invisible, but here, among these strangers turned friends, he felt seen. When the night ended, Alejandro walked with Roberto back to the cottage. The stars above were brighter than Roberto had ever seen in the city, their light casting a gentle glow over the ranch. As they reached the porch, Alejandro turned to his father. "I'll be back tomorrow to help with anything you need," Alejandro said. "But this is your space now. Take your time to settle in." Roberto looked at his son, gratitude and pride welling up in his chest. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for everything." Alejandro smiled. "You don't have to thank me, Papa. You deserve this." That night, as Roberto lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling and listened to the distant sounds of the ranch. The chirping of crickets, the soft neighing of horses, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. This place wasn't just a refuge, it was an opportunity to rediscover himself. The seeds of belonging had been planted, and though Roberto didn't yet know what the future held, he felt ready to embrace it. A life rekindled. The early morning sun peeked through the curtains of Roberto's new cottage, bathing the room in soft golden light. For the first time in years, he woke with a sense of purpose. His mind wandered to the stables, to the therapeutic riding program Clara had mentioned. The idea both excited and intimidated him. It had been so long since he had felt needed, since he had worked with horses, since he had felt like himself. As he dressed, Roberto's gaze fell on the photo album he had placed by the window the day before. Opening it, he flipped through the pages slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of photos that had faded with time. There was one of Sofia, smiling brightly in the garden behind their San Antonio home. Another of Alejandro as a boy, proudly holding a basket of freshly picked tomatoes. And then a photo of Palomo, his loyal horse, standing tall and strong in the field. "Would you look at me now, old friend?" Roberto whispered to the image of Palomo. "I'm starting over, just like we did when we built that farm." After breakfast, Roberto decided to visit the stables. The walk through the ranch was serene, the crisp air filled with the earthy scent of hay and freshly tilled soil. Residents waved and greeted him as he passed, their warmth making him feel more at home with each step. At the stables, he found Clara already hard at work, brushing down Estrella, the mare Roberto had met the day before. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting up with a smile. "Morning, Roberto. I was hoping you'd stop by." Roberto hesitated, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I thought I'd see what this program of yours is all about." Clara handed him a brush. "Perfect timing. We could use an extra set of hands. Estrella here loves a good grooming." Taking the brush, Roberto stepped closer to the horse, his movements cautious but steady. As he began to brush her coat, the familiar rhythm awakened a part of him he thought he had lost. The smell of the horse, the warmth of her body, and the quiet connection between man and animal, it all came rushing back. "She's a beauty," Roberto murmured. "She is," Clara agreed, "and she's one of the gentlest horses we have. Perfect for beginners and therapy sessions." Roberto looked up, intrigued. "Therapy sessions? How does that work?" Clara leaned against the stall door. "It's simple, really. Horses have a way of calming people, of making them feel grounded. We work with residents who might be dealing with loneliness, anxiety, or physical limitations. Just spending time with a horse can do wonders for the soul." Her words struck a chord in Roberto. He thought of his own loneliness, the nights he had spent staring at the walls of Alejandro's home, feeling like a shadow of himself. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe horses could heal in ways he hadn't considered. Over the next few days, Roberto threw himself into life at the ranch. He spent hours at the stables, learning the routines and getting to know each horse by name. There was Luna, a spirited mare with a mischievous streak, and Rico, a sturdy gelding who seemed to have endless patience. But Estrella remained his favorite, her gentle nature reminding him of Palomo. Word spread quickly among the residents that Roberto was helping to set up the therapeutic riding program. Some approached him out of curiosity, while others signed up eagerly, excited to try something new. Roberto found himself surrounded by people who valued his knowledge and experience, and for the first time in years, he felt truly useful. One afternoon, as Roberto was leading Estrella through a warm-up session, a young man in a wheelchair rolled into the stable. Clara introduced him as Diego, the grandson of one of the residents. Diego's been struggling with anxiety since his accident. Clara explained quietly. He's here visiting his abuela, and we thought the riding program might help. Diego looked skeptical, his arms crossed over his chest. I don't know about this, he said. I've never even been near a horse before. Roberto crouched down so he was at eye level with Diego. That's all right, he said gently. The first time I worked with a horse, I was nervous too. But you don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. Let's start small. He led Estrella closer, giving Diego time to adjust. The horse stood still, her calm demeanor helping to ease the tension in the air. Roberto handed Diego a brush. How about you try brushing her coat? It's simple, and it helps her relax. Diego hesitated, then reached out tentatively. As he brushed Estrella's side, a small smile broke across his face. She's soft, he said, almost to himself. That she is, Roberto replied, smiling. Over the next hour, Roberto guided Diego through the basics of horse care, explaining each step with patience and encouragement. By the time Diego left the stable, his skepticism had been replaced by a sense of accomplishment. That was amazing, Diego said. Thank you. Roberto watched him wheel away, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. It wasn't just about the horses. It was about connecting with people, helping them find their confidence, and showing them that they mattered. As the days turned into weeks, Roberto's life at the ranch continued to flourish. He became a mentor to other residents, teaching them the skills he had honed over decades of farming and working with animals. He organized group activities, from gardening projects to evening bonfires, where stories and laughter filled the air. But it wasn't just the residents who benefited from Roberto's presence. Alejandro and Mariana began visiting the ranch more frequently, bringing their young son along. Watching his grandson ride Estrella for the first time brought tears to Roberto's eyes. It was a moment of connection that bridged the gap between generations, reminding him that his family was still an integral part of his life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Roberto sat on the porch of his cottage, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Clara joined him, carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies. You've done something incredible here, Roberto, she said, sitting down beside him. You've brought this place to life in a way I never imagined. Roberto shook his head. I didn't do anything special. I just did what I know. Clara smiled. Sometimes, that's all it takes. As they sat in comfortable silence, Roberto looked out at the ranch, its paths glowing softly under the moonlight. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home, not just in a physical sense, but in his heart. The seeds of belonging had blossomed into something extraordinary, a life rekindled, a purpose renewed, and a future filled with hope. Bridges across generations. As weeks turned into months, Roberto's presence at Rancho Nuevo Amanecer became a cornerstone of its community. His days were filled with purpose, whether it was tending to the horses, teaching newcomers the basics of equine care, or organizing group activities that brought laughter and camaraderie to the residents. Yet even as he found himself immersed in this new chapter, Roberto couldn't ignore the quiet stirrings of a deeper longing, a connection with his family that still felt fragile. Alejandro had been visiting more frequently, often bringing Mariana and their son Mateo. The visits were always brief, a few hours at most, and while Roberto cherished the time with his grandson, he noticed that Alejandro seemed distracted, preoccupied with the pressures of work and family life. Roberto worried that their relationship, though cordial, was still marked by an unspoken distance. One Saturday morning, Alejandro arrived at the ranch earlier than usual. He stepped out of his SUV looking weary, his tie loosened, and his shoulders slumped. Roberto, who was fixing a wooden gate near the stables, waved him over. "Morning, Alejandro," Roberto said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're here early. Everything all right?" Alejandro hesitated, his expression guarded. "I wanted to talk to you, Papa. Somewhere private." Concerned, Roberto nodded and led Alejandro to the small garden behind his cottage. They sat on a wooden bench surrounded by blooming flowers, the hum of bees and the rustling of leaves filling the silence. Alejandro sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about how things have been since you came to live with me." Roberto's chest tightened. He wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but he braced himself for the worst. "I know I've made mistakes," Alejandro continued. "When you first moved in, I didn't know how to handle it. Mariana and we were overwhelmed, and I let that distance grow between us. I'm sorry, Papa. I should have done more." Roberto looked at his son, his heart softening. "You did what you could, Alejandro. Life gets busy. I understand." Alejandro shook his head. "That's not an excuse. You gave me everything growing up, and I didn't show you the same care when you needed it most. Seeing you here, thriving, it made me realize how much I took for granted. I don't want us to drift apart again." The sincerity in Alejandro's voice touched Roberto deeply. For so long he had felt like a burden, but now he saw the guilt his son carried. Reaching out, Roberto placed a hand on Alejandro's shoulder. "It's never too late to start over," Roberto said. "Look at me. I thought my life was over, but this place gave me a second chance. We can have that too, if we both try." Alejandro nodded, his eyes misty. "I want that, Papa. I really do." In the weeks that followed, Alejandro made a concerted effort to strengthen their bond. He started visiting the ranch more regularly, not just as a son checking in, but as a partner in Roberto's new life. Together, they worked on small projects around the ranch, from repairing fences to planting a new section of the community garden. Alejandro even helped Roberto organize a ranch-wide event, a harvest festival, to celebrate the changing seasons. The festival became a pivotal moment for the ranch. Residents and their families came together to enjoy games, music, and a feast made from the garden's fresh produce. Roberto, dressed in his old cowboy hat and boots, looked every bit the part of the proud rancher he had once been. He watched as Mateo rode Estrella with Mariana guiding him, his laughter ringing out like a melody. During the festival, Alejandro stood beside Roberto, a sense of pride evident on his face. "You've created something incredible here, Papa," he said. "This place, these people, it's like a big family." Roberto smiled. "It is. And you're part of it too." One evening, after most of the festival guests had left, Roberto found Mateo lingering by the stables, staring up at the sky. The boy's small hands gripped the wooden fence as he watched the stars twinkle above. "What are you thinking about, Mito?" Roberto asked as he approached. Mateo turned to him, his wide eyes shining. "Grandpa, do you think I could ever have a horse of my own?" Roberto chuckled, ruffling Mateo's hair. "Having a horse isn't just fun, you know. It's a lot of work. You'd have to take care of it every day." "I can do it," Mateo said with determination. "I want to learn like you." Roberto's heart swelled with pride. "All right then. How about we start by teaching you how to care for Estrella? If you can handle that, we'll talk about getting you a horse one day." Mateo beamed, throwing his arms around Roberto. "Thank you, Grandpa." As they stood there under the starlit sky, Roberto felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about teaching Mateo how to care for a horse. It was about passing on a legacy, about reconnecting with his family in a way that felt meaningful and lasting. Roberto's journey of the ranch wasn't just about finding a new home. It was about rediscovering himself and rebuilding the relationships that mattered most. Alejandro, Mariana, and Mateo became frequent visitors, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and a desire to share in Roberto's newfound joy. The therapeutic writing program flourished under Roberto's guidance, helping residents and visitors alike find healing and confidence. Diego, the young man in the wheelchair, became one of Roberto's most dedicated students, eventually working up the courage to ride Estrella on his own. Seeing the transformation in Diego reminded Roberto of his own journey, how he had found strength and purpose in the most unexpected of places. One quiet evening, as Roberto sat on the porch of his cottage, Alejandro joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They sat together in companionable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Do you ever miss San Antonio?" Alejandro asked after a while. Roberto thought for a moment. "I do," he admitted. "I miss the land, the memories, but I don't miss the loneliness. Here, I found something I didn't know I was looking for, and I have you to thank for that." Alejandro smiled. "You gave me a good life, Papa. It's only right that I do the same for you." As the stars began to fill the sky, Roberto felt a deep sense of peace. He had spent so long feeling like an afterthought, like a burden. But now, surrounded by family and community, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The legacy of the heart. The morning sun broke over Rancho Nuevo Amancer, casting a warm glow on the rolling hills and dewdrop-kissed gardens. Roberto sat on the porch of his cottage, sipping his coffee and watching the ranch come to life. Residents emerged from their homes, some heading toward the garden, others gathering by the stable to start their day with the horses. It was a sight that never failed to fill him with gratitude. He had found not just a home, but a place where he truly belonged. But today wasn't just any day. It was a day of reflection and celebration, a day Roberto hadn't imagined he'd ever experience again. Alejandro had organized a special event at the ranch to honor his father's contributions and the community Roberto had helped build. The idea had come to Alejandro after a quiet conversation with Clara, who spoke about the profound impact Roberto had on the ranch's residents. "You've created more than a program, Roberto," Clara had told him. "You've created hope." The preparations began early. Tables were set up under the sprawling oak tree, adorned with wildflowers and handmade decorations crafted by the residents. The therapeutic writing program participants were eager to show their progress, and Diego, who had blossomed under Roberto's mentorship, had volunteered to lead a demonstration. Alejandro arrived with Mariana and Mateo and Tao, their car loaded with food and supplies for the gathering. Mateo ran up to Roberto, his face alight with excitement. "Grandpa, look," he exclaimed, holding up a small hand-painted sign that read Roberto's Ranch. "We made this for you." Roberto chuckled, ruffling Mateo's hair. "It's perfect, Mio. Thank you." As the festivities began, Roberto couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the love and appreciation surrounding him. Residents and their families approached him throughout the day, sharing stories of how the ranch and Roberto's presence had changed their lives. "I never thought I'd ride a horse again after my stroke," an older woman named Maria said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But you believed in me, Roberto. You made me feel like I could do anything." Diego, now confident and self-assured, stood before the gathered crowd and spoke about his journey. "Before I came here, I thought my life was over," he said, his voice steady. "But Mr. Roberto showed me that there's always a way forward. He didn't just teach me how to ride a horse. He taught me how to believe in myself." The applause that followed brought tears to Roberto's eyes. He had spent so much of his life feeling like his best days were behind him. Yet here he was, surrounded by people whose lives he had touched in ways he hadn't even realized. Later that afternoon, Alejandro took the stage. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. "When my father came to live with us," Alejandro said, his voice thick with emotion, "I didn't fully understand the man he was, or the man he could still become. I was too caught up in my own life to see what he needed. But this ranch, this place gave us both a second chance. Alejandro turned to Roberto, his eyes glistening. Papa, you've always been my hero. You taught me the value of hard work, of love, and of family. And now you've shown me what it means to live with purpose. Thank you for everything you've done, not just for me, but for everyone here. The crowd erupted into applause as Alejandro stepped down and embraced his father. Roberto, rarely at a loss for words, found himself speechless. All he could do was hold his son tightly, the years of distance and misunderstanding melting away in that single moment. As the sun began to set, the ranch transformed into a scene of golden light and soft shadows. Residents gathered around a bonfire, sharing stories and laughter as the flames crackled and danced. Roberto sat with his family. Matteo perched on his knee as they roasted marshmallows and watched the stars emerge. It was then that Alejandro leaned over and handed Roberto a small wrapped package. "Open it," he said, smiling. Roberto carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a leather-bound journal. Inside, Alejandro had written the words, "A legacy of love," on the first page. "It's for your stories, Papa," Alejandro explained. "Your memories, your lessons, everything you want to pass down. This ranch is part of your legacy, but I want your words to live on too." Tears filled Roberto's eyes as he ran his fingers over the journal's cover. "Thank you, Mio," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." That night, as the fire died down and the guests began to disperse, Roberto sat alone under the oak tree, the journal resting in his lap. He thought about his journey, from the tragedy that had taken everything from him to the unexpected joy he had found at the ranch. He thought about Sofia, whose love had been the foundation of his life, and how proud she would be of the man he had become. Opening the journal, Roberto began to write. He wrote about his childhood, his years with Sofia, and the lessons he had learned as a father. He wrote about the ranch, the people who had become his family, and the sense of purpose that had reignited his spirit. And as he wrote, Roberto realized that his story wasn't just his own. It was a story of resilience, of love, and of the unbreakable bonds that connect us all. It was a story he was proud to leave behind, a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. The next morning, as the sun rose over Rancho Nuevo Amancer, Roberto felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He walked to the stables, greeted Estrella with a gentle pat, and prepared for another day filled with purpose and joy. His life had come full circle, from a place of loss and despair to one of hope and fulfillment. And as he stood in the warmth of the morning light, Roberto knew one thing for certain. The best chapters of his story had only just begun. The end.